To correct your posture, it's absolutely essential that you address the condition of your torso. But what exactly is your torso? Can you really change your torso? And if so, how? Today, we'll start the journey of answering these questions. Your torso is your body if you subtract off your legs, arms, neck, and head. The torso has two major bony structures. At the upper end, there's the rib cage, and at the lower end, there's the pelvis. The top of the rib cage is the top of the torso. The bottom of the pelvis, which are the sit bones, is the bottom of the torso. There are a number of ways that you can improperly use your torso, but to start with, we can ask, when you're standing, how should your rib cage and pelvis be oriented? That might sound like an unusual question to you. Do people actually orient their rib cage and pelvis? Don't those bony structures just kinda end up where they end up? Is it possible to change how you stand? Is it possible to change the orientation of your rib cage and pelvis and improve how you stand? If you think it over, obviously there are orientations of the rib cage and pelvis that everyone would agree are suboptimal. Many people who begin to research posture come to believe they have APT or swayback posture, lordosis or kyphosis, which is to say, most people recognize that their spine is bent in an undesirable way. If your spine is bent and contorted, your rib cage and pelvis will of course be out of place. But really, there is no separation. When you move your rib cage or pelvis out of place, it is the same act as bending your spine. Any change you make to your rib cage or pelvis will change your spine. And if you orient your rib cage and pelvis properly, you will lengthen and straighten your spine. It's understandable that most people are unfamiliar with the idea of controlling the orientation of their rib cage and pelvis. It's not something most people have thought much about. But if you want to improve your posture and avoid the pains and other various health problems that are the result of poor posture, you're going to have to change the orientation of your rib cage and pelvis. To do that, you have to know what is the optimal orientation of these major bony structures. There is no better expert to consult on this question than Jando Masoero. We'll explore the specifics of why he's right in the future, but for now, let's just examine what he says. He would like us to have both our rib cage and pelvis upright and not tilted. For the rib cage, that means that the front of the rib cage should be flat. Specifically, the upper sternum, the lower sternum, and the eighth ribs should all be on the same plane. He specifies the eighth rib because the lower ribs below the eighth rib begin to curve back in towards the body a bit, so the lower ribs will not be on this frontal plane. But the front of the chest should be essentially 90 degrees to the ground. That's not what you will see in virtually anyone around you. We can take a look at a few pictures and see that people instead have a significant angle at the front of their rib cage. The sternum, far from being 90 degrees to the ground, is pulled back and down at the top. The bottom end of the sternum is pushed forward to be the furthest forward point on the torso. With a little thought, we can see that really what's happening is the entire rib cage is being tilted or rotated. The top end of the rib cage is moving back and down, and the bottom end is moving forward and up. That's why we see where the lowest ribs should be, there is empty space. This is certainly not a rib cage that is upright. It's a rib cage that is tilted. Because Masoero uses points on bony structures, there is no real issue with muscle, fat, or breast tissue throwing things off. You can feel the bone of your sternum or your eighth rib just under the skin. This is why using bones as landmarks is really the most sensible way to think about these things. We are orienting the bony structure, so other superficial differences are irrelevant. It's a little trickier to see the tilting of the pelvis than it is the tilting of the rib cage, but a surefire sign is the significant sloping of the back of the pelvis that leads into a hollowing of the lower back. It's not the glute muscles causing this degree of sloping. It's a tilting of the pelvis where the top end goes forward and down while the bottom end goes back and up. That's why you can see the bottom of the pelvis, the sit bones, being pushed backwards. It's the natural result of this rotation of the pelvis. There are a few things to consider when attempting to bring the pelvis into its upright configuration. But today, we'll focus on just one basic starting point. We want this top front point on the iliac crest, which we will call the iliac, to be on the same plane as the front of the rib cage. If we again examine some pictures, we can see that people tend to have their iliac forward of their upper sternum, but not quite as far forward as their lower sternum and lower ribs. Having all these points on the same plane will orient our rib cage and pelvis to be upright, with the rib cage directly above the pelvis. But does this information really help us? How would we know with any certainty if our upper sternum, lower sternum, eighth rib, and iliac were on the same plane? If we attempted to get them on the same plane, how could we know we've succeeded? Is this just academic information with no practical utility? Or is there something relatively simple that we could do that would allow us to put this knowledge into action and change the shape of our torso? Yes, there is. Think it over, maybe you can figure it out. And then tune in to the next episode where we will answer this question and delve further into understanding the mysterious and unfamiliar world that is your own body.